So we've examined some of the objections to standard analytic metaphysics, and in this video we're going to look at naturalized metaphysics in a bit more detail. As I mentioned, the basic idea of naturalized metaphysics is that it's only by applying scientific methods and scientific results that we can come to any worthwhile metaphysical conclusions. Now, naturalized metaphysics needs to perform something of a balancing act. On the one hand, it needs to go beyond simply what is said in the sciences. We need to say more about the world than what we would get from reading science. I mean, this is supposed to be metaphysics, not simply science journalism for philosophers, right? So we need to make substantial claims about the world that are not made simply in science. On the other hand, we need to remain informed by the sciences or grounded in the sciences. We need to avoid speculation. So let's look at the first problem. How exactly is naturalized metaphysics any different from science? Well, one idea proposed by Paul Humphreys in his article in the book Scientific Metaphysics is that naturalized metaphysics can go beyond what scientists accept due to underdetermination. Now, the traditional idea of underdetermination is that for any set of data, many different theories will be compatible with that data. So by analogy, if you have points on a graph, there are many different lines that you could draw through these points. You can think of the points as being evidence and the lines as being theories. No matter what evidence you have, you can always construct competing theories on the basis of that evidence. So scientific theories are, we say, underdetermined by the evidence. And this is a general problem that arises for every scientific theory, and there are interesting questions about how we can decide on a scientific theory, given that the evidence doesn't determine one of them. But Humphreys points out that underdetermination goes a bit further than this. Even assuming that we accept a particular scientific theory, this theory will be compatible with many different metaphysical theories. So in the same way that evidence doesn't determine the scientific theory, so the scientific theory doesn't determine the more general metaphysical theory. Humphreys gives the example of different interpretations of quantum mechanics. You have the many worlds interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation, the ensemble interpretation, and so on. These different interpretations are all compatible with the basic quantum theory, but they make very different claims about the fundamental structure of the world. So Humphreys suggests that actually this is really a metaphysical debate, and so this is one way in which metaphysics goes beyond what science tells us. So that's the first problem. Now, the second problem is this need to remain grounded in science, right? Naturalized metaphysics is supposed to be in some sense grounded in science, and in this way it avoids the sort of speculative excesses of analytic metaphysics. Now, we need to say more about what this involves. The most detailed proposal for naturalized metaphysics is given by James Ladyman and Ross in their book Everything Must Go. Their basic idea is that naturalized metaphysics is the attempt to unify hypotheses that are accepted in contemporary science. We take scientific hypotheses and then we come up with more general metaphysical theories that show how those hypotheses are connected. And there are two points here, right? So the first idea is that unification is something worthwhile. Unifying two seemingly unconnected hypotheses is an epistemic achievement. And that, I think, is fair enough. If a hypothesis is unconnected to the rest of knowledge, then we have a mystery. So we want to show how all our beliefs are connected to form a coherent whole. And this is borne out in the history of science. Many of the most important developments in science have involved unification, like Maxwell's unification of electricity and magnetism. The second idea is that there is no particular science devoted to unification. So although unification is important in science, we don't have a specific field that focuses on trying to unify hypotheses. Indeed, it seems that over time science has become increasingly specialized. So we have an argument like this: unification is worthwhile, no particular science is devoted to unification, and therefore that's something that metaphysicians can do. This is the basic justification of naturalistic metaphysics as Ladyman and Ross see it. Now, one immediate problem that I think is worth highlighting here is that, although there is no particular science devoted to unification, scientists do nevertheless unify hypotheses. Unification seems to happen automatically in the process of science. And so I think there's a legitimate question about why would scientists need metaphysicians to help them? I mean, they seem to be perfectly capable of unifying hypotheses themselves. In fact, scientists are the relevant experts, so it would seem that they're better placed to work out how to unify scientific hypotheses. And in the history of science, when unifications have occurred, it's usually been scientists who've done it. So immediately, there's a bit of a worry about Ladyman and Ross's basic idea, their basic conception of what naturalized metaphysics should be about. But as I say, their idea is naturalized metaphysics involves unification of science. Now they flesh this out with two principles that they say should be applied by naturalistic metaphysicians. The first is the principle of naturalistic closure, and this makes two claims. First, it claims that no hypothesis that the approximately consensual current scientific practice declares to be beyond our ability to investigate should be taken seriously. All hypotheses need to be, in principle, empirically testable. Assume that our best physics tells us that the Big Bang is a boundary across which no information can pass. I think this may be controversial today, but let's assume that this is true, that the Big Bang is a sort of strict boundary. Assume that our best physics tells us that. Well, then any claim about what happened before the Big Bang would be untestable. It would be beyond our ability to investigate. And so that would be ruled out. Metaphysics shouldn't concern itself with any claim like that. Second, any metaphysical hypothesis that is to be taken seriously should have some identifiable bearing on the relationship between at least two relatively specific hypotheses that are either regarded as confirmable by institutionally bona fide science or are regarded as motivated and in principle confirmable by such science. So the reason it must have a bearing on two scientific hypotheses is to pursue unification. Two different hypotheses that seem to be separate are shown to be connected. Now, when Ladyman and Ross say that metaphysics needs to have an identifiable bearing on these hypotheses, what they have in mind is explanation. The idea is that the metaphysical hypothesis needs to show that the two scientific hypotheses jointly have more explanatory power than when they are taken separately. So one aspect of explanatory power, of increasing explanatory power, would be bringing more phenomena under the scope of the explanation. So the metaphysical hypothesis might show how these two scientific hypotheses together apply to a greater range of phenomena than they do when they're separate. Alternatively, we can increase explanatory power by reducing the different kinds of laws or causal processes that we cite in an explanation. If we have two seemingly separate hypotheses which explain some set of phenomena, we can increase explanatory power by showing that actually they're not separate, right? The same laws, the same causal processes are involved in each case. And I would assume that this is probably the kind of role that we would expect naturalistic metaphysics to play, right? It's going to involve showing that it's going to involve trying to sort of reduce the numbers of laws and causal processes that are cited in the sciences. Now, one thing you might ask is, well, if metaphysics is supposed to deal only with scientific hypotheses, what counts as a scientific hypothesis? Well, as is suggested in this principle, Ladyman and Ross take an institutional line on this. The kind of hypotheses that metaphysicians should be looking at are just those hypotheses that, that say professional scientists could propose as targets of investigation to a major funding agency. So there's an institution of professional science, which is practiced by accredited people at universities who receive money from certain kinds of funding agencies. And Ladyman and Ross's thought is a scientific hypothesis is just a hypothesis that would be investigated in that institutional context. So they don't attempt to provide a kind of demarcation criterion between science and non-science. They just sort of look at it institutionally, right? We have this institution of science, and the kinds of hypotheses that we are looking at are the hypotheses that are taken seriously within that institution. So Ladyman and Ross are extremely deferential to how science happens to be practiced. And we might worry about this. We might think that metaphysics should perhaps serve a more critical function with respect to science, but it looks like there's not going to be much scope for that here. We'll come back to this point later. Ladyman and Ross then introduce the additional constraint that one of these two scientific hypotheses must be a hypothesis from fundamental physics. It's not good enough merely to unify biology or psychology, say. Metaphysics needs to be based in fundamental physics. And there are a couple of reasons for this. For one thing, metaphysics is supposed to have a general scope. It's concerned with the fundamental structure of the world. Well, you're not going to get that kind of scope from any science other than physics. But second and more importantly, Ladyman and Ross think that we should abide by what they call the primacy of physics constraint, which says special scientific hypotheses that conflict with fundamental physics or such consensus as there is in fundamental physics should be rejected for that reason alone. Fundamental physical hypotheses are not symmetrically hostage to the conclusions of the special sciences. Physics has a great authority that other sciences lack. And I think this is one reason why they want metaphysics to be strongly connected with physics. Right? Physics is sort of the queen of the sciences, and we would want our philosophy to be based in the best science. Ladyman and Ross give essentially two arguments for the PPC. First, there's an induction on the history of science. Historically, hypotheses that postulate non-physical entities and non-physical processes have failed. So think about Newton appealed to the intervention of God to explain the long-term stability of the solar system. Well, that turned out to be unnecessary. Similarly, intelligent design arguments to explain complex adaptations such as the eye and the heart were superseded by Darwinian natural selection. An intelligent design to explain abiogenesis is no longer taken seriously by scientists studying the origin of life. Beyond God, an idea that was once popular in biology was the notion of an élan vital, or vital force, this kind of special non-physical substance that was thought to be necessary to account for the special properties of life. Well, we now view organisms in more mechanistic terms. I mean, certainly we don't think there's any special non-physical forces involved. So, non-physical hypotheses continually fail. Whenever people have thought that there might be more to the world than what is described in physics, they've turned out to be wrong. The converse point, of course, is that physical hypotheses have been remarkably successful. Processes in higher sciences like chemistry, biology, psychology can increasingly be understood in physical terms. Think about the triumph of molecular genetics, where we've uncovered the structure of the DNA molecule, we understand its parts, and we can sort of understand it down to the arrangement of atoms, which is the domain of physics. So historically, it seems that physical hypotheses are privileged. Now, I think that this argument is rather questionable. One thing we have to bear in mind is that when we say that something is physical or not physical, that's a judgment that we're making in retrospect. Many things like élan vital are considered non-physical, arguably because they failed to be confirmed. Right? Had we discovered some sort of special biological vital force and and we'd confirmed it experimentally, and then we were able to manipulate it and use it in technological applications and so on, well, it would arguably have just become viewed as part of physicalism. We would have thought, okay, it turns out there's more to the physical world than what we thought. And this has happened many times in the history of science. When Newton first proposed his theory, many scientists rejected it because he didn't give a mechanistic explanation of gravity. Gravity in Newton's theory was this sort of occult force that could exhibit action at a distance. And this was in tension with the prevailing standard that science should offer explanations that cite mechanical causes and effects, which ultimately should be reducible to an explanation in terms of atoms and the void. But of course, in the end, Newton's theory was so useful that it triumphed, and scientists simply dropped the requirement that theories should provide mechanistic explanations. I mean, it's our world of forces and fields and bizarre quantum behavior. I mean, that would seem very spooky and mystical to Newton's contemporaries. So, the conception of sort of what counts as a physical process or material process has changed pretty substantially. Today we consider ourselves to be good, straight physicalists, but if you were to speak to one of Newton's contemporaries, they might have a rather different idea. So, quite plausibly then, physicalism or materialism is more of an attitude or a stance. It's the idea that science is our best guide to reality, or something like that. It's the idea that we should believe whatever is discovered by our best sciences, no more and no less. But exactly what counts, as a physical process or a physical hypothesis, depends then on the state of science at the time. And if this kind of view is right, if physicalism is more of an attitude or a norm, then obviously non-physical hypotheses are going to fail in science, while the physical hypotheses are going to be successful. Bas van Frassen has a really nice article on this called I think it's called Science, Materialism and False Consciousness, which is worth checking out. A second argument that Ladyman and Ross give for the PPC is that it's regulative in science. Basically, all special sciences assume the primacy of physics. If a hypothesis contradicts our best physics, for that reason alone it will be resisted. And if metaphysics is to be scientifically informed, it should have the same kinds of standards as every other science. And so in this case, that means treating physics as the queen. Again, I'm not really convinced by this claim. It seems to me that the primacy of physics is more just a sort of rule of thumb or a heuristic. In general, you've probably got a better shot with hypotheses that don't contradict our best physics. But if a biologist proposed a hypothesis that contradicted current physics, and then the evidence supported it, and all of the experiments suggested it was true, and so on, I think scientists would, or at least should, seriously consider it. I think we might worry that there's something kind of anti-scientific about Ladyman and Ross's argument here. One of the most important principles of science is that all hypotheses are, at least in principle, falsifiable. I mean, we should be open-minded enough to acknowledge that even our best theories could be wrong. There are developments that could show them to be incorrect. In which case, we can't rule out by fiat that no results from the special sciences could contradict our best physics. In fact, if anything, we should be trying to contradict our best physics. So, as I say, I'm not convinced that science does adopt anything like the PPC as a regulative ideal. Anyway, that is Ladyman and Ross's view, and they use this foundation to develop some of their own metaphysical conclusions. I'm interested here in the method rather than the specific results, so I won't go into those, but you can see my video on structural realism, where I explain one of the metaphysical conclusions that they defend. Okay, let's consider some objections to naturalized metaphysics. Well, first of all, a good point that's raised by Cian Dor in his review of the book is that Ladyman and Ross's view here requires us to reject a host of seemingly reasonable arguments without actually explaining why they fail. So consider the argument, the statue on my desk was made this morning, the lump of clay on my desk was made many weeks ago. If A is identical to B, then A and B cannot have existed for different lengths of time, so the statue is not identical to the lump of clay, so distinct objects can sometimes coincide. For Ladyman and Ross, this is unacceptably non-naturalistic. Their criterion would clearly rule it out because it doesn't appeal to any hypotheses from physics. But they don't tell us why exactly there's anything wrong with this argument. I mean, the argument seems to be valid. The premises seem to be true. So, as Dor says, what exactly are we supposed to do when we're faced with this argument? If we see that the argument is valid and we believe the premises, how can we not then draw the conclusion, right? What are we to do? Well, one obvious option would be to say that when we're faced with this kind of argument, we need to give up one of the premises. But that's not really so simple. So first of all, there's a question of which of the premises should we become agnostic about, right? The principle offered by Ladyman and Ross for naturalized metaphysics doesn't give us any guidance here. So, which premise are we supposed to give up? Which premise should we become skeptical about? And the other thing is that whichever one we become skeptical about, that's going to have pretty significant consequences for our other beliefs. So, for example, if I have to become skeptical about the claim that the statue on my desk was made this morning, well, that seems like a pretty extreme kind of skepticism, especially if I made the statue. Or maybe I'll give up the premise that if A is identical to B, then A and B cannot have existed for different lengths of time. Again, that seems like a very basic sort of claim. It's difficult. It doesn't seem even coherent to deny that claim. So if we take this line, if we say that we have to become agnostic about one of the premises or deny one of the premises, then we're going to have significant consequences for our other beliefs. And it seems like this isn't really motivated by science either. So, Ladyman and Ross want to have a naturalized view of philosophy. They want philosophy to be totally connected to the sciences, very tightly connected to the sciences. But, giving up any of the premises of this argument, it's not science that tells you, that motivates that. It's worth comparing Ladyman and Ross's view with other historical attacks on metaphysics. So famously, the logical positivists were very chilly towards metaphysics, and they came up with the theory of meaning, verificationism. I have a video explaining verificationism in more detail if you're interested, but the basic idea is that a sentence is meaningful only if it's either analytic or empirically verifiable. Analytic claims are those that are true by definition, like all bachelors are unmarried. That's true because bachelor is defined to mean unmarried man. And to say that a statement is empirically verifiable is to say that there are observations we could make that would show it to be true or false. So if I say there is a unicorn standing outside my window, it's easy to check whether or not that's true. You just open up the window and have a look. But what if I say there is an invisible, intangible, silent, odourless and otherwise undetectable unicorn standing outside my window? Well, that looks superficially like a meaningful claim, but it makes no difference whatsoever to our experience. Whether it's true or false, our experience of the world will be exactly the same. For the logical positivists, then, this kind of statement is literally meaningless. It's not even false, it simply fails to express a proposition. And the positivists believed that metaphysics, well, some metaphysics at least, was in this kind of boat. As such, they could identify what's wrong with metaphysical arguments, because if you show them a metaphysical argument, they would be able to point to one of the premises and say, well, that's meaningless, that's not expressing any proposition, so the argument doesn't work. Now, Ladyman and Ross don't offer anything like this. Right? They're perfectly happy to accept that sentences in analytic metaphysics papers are meaningful. So, what's the problem with the arguments? What are we, as Ciandor says, what are we supposed to do when we're faced with these arguments that seem sound? So I think that's quite a big problem with Ladyman and Ross's view. A second problem is that Ladyman and Ross's requirement of unification seems to be far too strong. Indeed, this is the case even from the perspective of naturalistic approaches, right? So remember that Ladyman and Ross require that any good metaphysics has a bearing on at least two scientific hypotheses. The trouble is that many interesting metaphysical arguments only appeal to one scientific hypothesis. And a simple example cited by Ciandor in the review is the argument from relativity theory against presentism. So presentism is a view in the philosophy of time that only the present exists. The universe is a constantly changing present moment. The past and the future are no longer or are not currently part of reality. And that's the basic common sense view, right? That's probably how most of us think about time commonsensically. This contrasts with eternalism, which claims that all times exist. They're all metaphysically on a par. Eternalism treats time in a similar way to how we would treat space. So I'm not currently in the White House. The White House isn't here. But the White House still exists. It exists just as my house exists. Similarly, Socrates doesn't exist now in 2017, but speaking unrestrictedly, he exists. He's just as much a part of reality as I am. For the eternalist, the passage of time is something of an illusion. There is no objective present moment. One of the most popular arguments for eternalism is drawn from special relativity. One of the consequences of special relativity is that whether or not two events are simultaneous depends on your reference frame. From reference frame A, let's say, events X and Y happen at the same time. But from reference frame B, X and Y happen at different times. And this isn't just a matter of limits of observation or anything like that. It's a fact in the world. And this is known as the relativity of simultaneity. There is no objective fact whether or not two events are simultaneous, whether they occurred at the same time. Well, this seems to undermine the notion of an objective present. What is the present moment, right? What's going on in the present? Well, the present moment consists of just those things that are simultaneous with whatever you're doing right now. But there's no fact of the matter what events are simultaneous with whatever you're doing right now. So there's no fact of the matter what is present. And it seems that there is then no objective present. So we have an argument like this. If presentism is true, simultaneity is absolute, but simultaneity is not absolute, so presentism is not true. Now, this only appeals to one scientific hypothesis, so there's no unification going on here, but surely this is scientifically acceptable. I mean, why wouldn't it be? Even some scientists endorse this argument. And a lot of work has been done by people working in the metaphysics of time, analysing this argument. And, I mean, that seems reasonably legitimate to me. Or consider interpretations of quantum mechanics. Again, it's not obvious that there's any unification going on there. We're simply interested in asking what the metaphysical consequences of this specific theory might be. Why would this be wrong? I think perhaps part of the problem here arises from the fact that although unification is certainly important, it's only one among many things that we want from science. So privileging unification in particular perhaps it leads Ladyman and Ross to kind of overlook other kinds of benefits that metaphysical theorizing might provide. Right, a third criticism of Ladyman and Ross is that science itself is grounded on metaphysical presuppositions. One of the assumptions driving analytic metaphysics is that empirical science is trustworthy because it's based entirely on observation and experiment, rather than a priori theorizing. There's a fairly strict distinction being drawn between a priori metaphysics and empirical science. But a lot of work in the history and philosophy of science suggests that scientists also make a priori assumptions about the structure of the world. This is a big theme in the work of people like Thomas Kuhn, for example. I've got a couple of videos on Kuhn if you look for my video on scientific revolutions, if you're interested. Kuhn suggests that scientists adopt certain overarching paradigms which supply the general principles of the field and tell the scientist what the world is like. Paradigms aren't simply derived from observation. Often, in fact, there will be a lot of conflict between the paradigm and observation, and much of the work of science involves resolving puzzles like these. It involves trying to kind of force the paradigm into the shape of observation. But adopting a paradigm is going to involve a lot of metaphysical assumptions. So an example that's given by Anjan Chakravarti in his article on the prospects of naturalized metaphysics is he suggests that in medical research we find two conflicting metaphysical presuppositions, reductionism and organicism. Reductionism tries to explain diseases by citing factors on the genetic and molecular levels. So we explain cancer, for example, by we might cite some genetic predisposition, or we look at molecular changes in cells. On the other hand, organicism views organisms and disease as kind of holistic entities. It views them as these sort of emergent phenomena that can only be fully understood by taking into account higher levels of organisation. So we might try to explain the production of cancer cells in terms of abnormal tissue organisation. And so there's these sort of two assumptions in medical research that are competing, and they lead scientists to organise their research in different ways. So we see that metaphysical ideas are built into the practice of science, and this leads to two problems for Ladyman and Ross's project. First, since for them metaphysics is just about unifying scientific hypotheses, it looks like their metaphysics will simply end up being deferential to certainly deferential to science, and therefore deferential to whatever metaphysical presuppositions happen to be built into science. But we might think that if science kind of implicitly assumes metaphysics anyway, then really philosophers should be playing a more critical role. And we shouldn't just be deferring to science because otherwise we're just going to end up accepting whatever metaphysical views happen to be prevailing at the time. Second, and maybe more importantly, if metaphysical assumptions are built into any scientific research, well, this might suggest that the very idea of purging intellectual inquiry, of intuition and a priori theorizing, is misguided. Arguably, to engage in scientific research requires the implicit assumption of certain metaphysical theories. So if this kind of a priori metaphysics is illegitimate, then science is also illegitimate. So that is one objection that some people have had. Okay, a final criticism of naturalistic approaches comes from Ian James Kidd, who is concerned that naturalistic approaches to philosophy overlook the contingency of science. His claim is that the idea we can't assume that science as we know it will continue to play a significant role in our society in the future. So in 50, 100, 200 years, human society may be organised in very different ways, and science might not have any real authority. So Kidd points out that there are already groups of people who are aware of science, but whose cultures are not based on science. So first of all, there are what he calls the indifferentists, and these are cultures where science is just of no significance. Science fails to connect with their goals and projects. For example, the Amish. Modern science is absent from their lives. They just don't care about it. Second, there are the corruptionists who view science as a source of corruption and decay. These people will generally be people who are sort of in modern society. They're in a society with science, but they would prefer not to be. Kidd cites the Gnostics, the Luddites, and some contemporary environmentalists as examples. For these people, science is a negative force to be actively resisted. It's a force that has what they perceive as bad consequences for their lives. Now, the point of Kidd's article is not to defend any of these approaches, but just to point out that these are approaches that humans have sometimes taken. And so it is at least possible that science will fall from its privileged position. We might move to a post-scientific culture where science completely loses its cognitive authority. Alternatively, even if science remains a significant cultural force, it could change in quite substantial ways. So modern science is generally practiced as what is known as big science. Science today is conducted by very large research teams, usually managed by university institutions, who work with very sophisticated, expensive equipment like the Large Hadron Collider. We pour billions of pounds into science, and science develops through these large-scale projects centralised at specific institutions. Now, science wasn't always like this. Go back into the 1800s, science was more practiced by sort of gentlemen amateurs who were either rich themselves or they maybe had some patron, but certainly these kind of big research teams, big expensive experimental equipment, this is something that is developed, really developed during the World Wars. I think that one of the main reasons that it developed was for trying to develop things like the atom bomb. Governments wanted to have this deadly technology, and that was one of the things that prompted the development of big science. So this is kind of historically contingent, and maybe it will change again in the future. And there are in fact already reasons to expect that society might undergo some pretty radical changes over the next century. Right now we face all kinds of problems. We've got this rising inequality. We have climate change, antimicrobial resistance, resource depletion, overpopulation, destruction of topsoils. It looks like either we're going to need to make some radical changes towards a more sustainable form of life, or if you're pessimistic, maybe society will just decline or collapse. Collapse has occurred many times in the past, so there's no reason why our society shouldn't collapse. Either way, the practice of science and the role of science in society are likely to change as well. So why does this matter? Well, I think that Kidd's point is that, science as we know it is possibly a lot more fragile than we might assume. And so philosophers shouldn't tie themselves so strongly to science. Philosophers shouldn't be sort of strictly concerned just with one way of life that is likely to change in the future. Ladyman and Ross want us to purge metaphysics of everything that is non-scientific, and they want metaphysics to be grounded specifically in fundamental physics. But metaphysics was being practiced long before modern physics emerged, and we might hope for it to continue even after modern physics has been displaced. So Kidd advocates a more pluralistic approach, right? It's fine for philosophers to pursue things like naturalistic metaphysics, but we should also try to sustain other ways of doing philosophy, and we should sort of cast a critical eye on all philosophical approaches. If philosophy is to survive through radical social changes, just as it has done for the last 2,000 years, then it needs to be a broad church that allows for many different approaches to problems. I mean, and in particular, we might think, why would you want metaphysics, say, to be tied to fundamental physics? I mean, there's certainly no reason to expect that physics will remain so special. Physics had some incredibly exhibited some incredibly remarkable progress, especially with general relativity and then quantum mechanics. I mean, those are really striking theories. But as a subject, as a discipline, it faces some pretty serious problems. At this point, we're reaching the limits of what we can experimentally test. I remember hearing that there's some sort of string theory in that area, where in order to test it, we would need particle accelerators the size of galaxies, which obviously we're never going to have. I mean, maybe we'll come up with some other way of testing it, but it's possible that we're just kind of reaching the limits of what we can actually do in physics. And so, if that's the case, we, as philosophers, probably wouldn't want our discipline to be tied too strongly to fundamental physics. Anyway, that's all for today. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.